A routine traffic stop. Simple. Uncomplicated. Or at least, that's how it should have been. But for Officer Bradley Larson, what started as a minor infraction quickly spiraled into something much darker. His instincts, honed from years on the force, led him to assume the worst. Yet, the man in front of him wasn't who he expected. Eric Porter, unaware of the storm brewing, was merely on his way home after a taxing day at work. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the streets of Sacramento, Eric's sedan hummed gently, the cool air from the AC offering a small comfort against the suffocating heat. The radio provided a soft backdrop to the rhythm of the road, each note almost lost in the busy cacophony of city sounds. The light ahead of him turned yellow. He eased off the gas, letting the car glide to a stop, but the light shifted to red before he came to a complete halt. Then, like a sudden flash of lightning, the flashing red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror. The blare of the siren caught through the evening's calm. Eric's hands instinctively tightened on the wheel. He glanced at the mirror, brows furrowing. Not panic, just confusion. Pulling over to the side of the road, he rolled down his window. The cruiser slid to a stop behind him. From it stepped Officer Bradley Larson. Late 20s, early 30s maybe, with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming with authority. He adjusted his belt and walked toward the car with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His voice was terse, sharp. License and registration. Eric didn't argue. He reached calmly into the glove compartment, his fingers brushing against the edges of the papers. He handed over his driver's license, his movements steady, measured. But Larson wasn't done. His eyes never left Eric, scanning, assessing. Searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson's question sliced through the air like a blade. His posture shifted slightly, but enough to make the tension palpable. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric responded, his voice even, polite, but with a firmness that spoke volumes. "I thought I slowed down in time." Larson's eyes flickered, just for a moment, and then he stated, "You didn't come to a full stop at the light." Eric nodded, understanding. "I see. I thought I did, but I understand." But Larson wasn't listening. Not really. His gaze lingered on Eric, and something shifted. This wasn't just a routine stop. Not anymore. He eyed the license in his hand before asking, "You're not from around here, are you?" Eric hesitated for the briefest of moments before replying, "I moved here a few months ago." "My address is on the license." Larson barely heard the answer. His focus was already on something else. The way Eric was composed. Unbothered. Calm. Too calm. The officer took another step toward the car, his eyes narrowing. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Eric said. His voice didn't tremble. There was no edge. No signs of panic. But something in the air had shifted. Larson's question hung, thick with implication, a subtle accusation. The officer wasn't looking at him as a driver anymore. He was looking at him as something else. Something more. Eric felt it too. The tension crackled. But he didn't react. Larson wasn't prepared for the calm. He wasn't prepared for Eric's unwavering poise. Larson, growing impatient, tucked Eric's documents into his chest pocket. He didn't hurry. His movements were deliberate. And then, his words came. "Step out of the car." Eric's fingers tightened on the wheel. His face remained unreadable. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, voice steady, controlled. Larson's lips curled into a tight smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The words were a thinly veiled threat, hanging in the air like smoke. Eric exhaled slowly and, with calm precision, opened the door, stepping out. Larson's gaze flicked over him quickly, taking in the broad shoulders, the tailored suit, the immaculate posture. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. "Hands where I can see them," Larson barked, his eyes narrowing. Eric complied, his movements deliberate and calm. The air between them felt thick with the unspoken, but Eric wasn't backing down. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" he asked, voice still quiet but cutting. Larson's smirk deepened, but his eyes flashed briefly with a hint of irritation. "Just routine." We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful. Eric's brow raised, the question hanging in the air between them. Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else? The words hit Larson like a slap. His breath caught, but only for a moment. He regained his composure, straightening up. "Watch your tone," he growled, his hand drifting toward his belt, a reflex, the first sign of him slipping. "I'm simply asking a question," Eric responded, his voice low but unwavering. Larson leaned closer, his gaze sharpening. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Eric let the silence stretch, allowing it to settle. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Larson scoffed, dismissing the words as if they were beneath him, but he didn't answer. He stepped back, pacing in a small circle, his fingers tapping against his holster. The shift in dynamics was palpable. Eric wasn't reacting the way Larson expected. There was no fear, no anxiety. Just an unsettling calm. Poise. Control. And it threw Larson off balance. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered under his breath. It was almost an accusation. Eric didn't rise to it. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his voice unwavering. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For a moment, Larson froze, caught off guard. Something flickered in his eyes, a brief hesitation. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. The tension thickened, and Eric stood firm, a rock in the face of Larson's uncertainty. The officer's hand hovered by his belt, fingers tapping restlessly, the final moments before everything shifted. The real test was coming. Frustration simmered just beneath the surface of Officer Larson's expression, a tension so thick it seemed to pulse in the cool Sacramento air. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by someone like Eric, who looked like he could have stepped out of a corporate boardroom rather than from behind the wheel of a sedan. His gaze flickered back to the car, as though seeking some reason to justify his growing suspicion. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson barked, his voice tight, each word clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with disbelief yet calm. "Weapons," he repeated, incredulity lacing his words. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw clenched, and for a heartbeat, his usual control cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again," he growled. Eric paused, a flicker of something unreadable flashing across his face. Without further protest, he turned and placed his hands flat on the hood of his car. Larson's boots scraped against the asphalt, the crunch of each step punctuating the tension hanging in the air like an impending storm. As Larson moved to pat him down, his hands were rough, moving with a purpose that suggested more than just a standard search. It was an act of dominance, a challenge. But Eric didn't flinch. He remained a statue, unmoving, unwavering. No reaction. No discomfort. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back. The words were thick with annoyance, the admission almost an afterthought. Eric turned slowly, his expression still composed, though his eyes flickered with an almost imperceptible sharpness. "Of course I am," he replied, his voice smooth, steady. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Larson cut him off, his voice rising just a little too high. The words spilled out faster than he intended, betraying the cracks in his carefully crafted demeanor. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms casually, his body language a portrait of relaxation despite the thick tension swirling around them. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he replied, his voice neutral but his gaze sharp, like a man who had seen it all before. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed, suspicion and irritation burning brighter. "That so? You a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Or something." The ambiguity of his response pushed Larson even further, igniting something in him. With a growl of frustration, he took a step closer, invading Eric's personal space, his voice dropping to a near sneer. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met his gaze head-on, unflinching, and a quiet firmness entered his voice. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Larson's lip twitched as though a reflex had triggered in him, but it was no match for the controlled calm radiating from Eric. Fairness? Larson scoffed, the words dripping with derision. You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always... He stopped mid-sentence, the words hanging between them like smoke, unspoken and unfinished. Eric's expression didn't shift. But something about his posture did, his shoulders tightening, his gaze sharpening. That slight change in his bearing made Larson realize that whatever had been left unsaid, Eric had caught it, and it had hit its mark. People like me? Eric repeated softly, his voice quiet but charged with an undercurrent of meaning. Larson bristled, stepping back, as though the weight of what he had just let slip was starting to sink in. He muttered, his voice lacking the conviction it had held just moments before, "You know what I mean." "I think I do," Eric replied, his voice cutting through the air, calm but razor-sharp. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson's mouth opened, but no sound came. For the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. The tension between them thickened, and Eric's composed demeanor was doing something Larson wasn't prepared for. It was throwing him off balance. Finally, Eric broke the silence, his voice steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knitted, irritation creeping back into his voice. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, though his words were hollow, betraying his unease. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Larson's. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larson's hand twitch at his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, laden with a promise of something unspoken. Larson's gaze followed Eric's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," Eric said, his tone casual, almost as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." For a moment, Larson froze. His eyes darted between the badge and Eric's face, searching for a sign that this was some cruel joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only a quiet authority and a hint of something deeper, something disappointed. "Internal Affairs?" Larson repeated, his voice cracking slightly, his confidence crumbling with each passing second. "Yes," Eric replied, cutting him off. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Larson's face drained of color as the reality of Eric's words set in. His posture sagged slightly, and he took a small step back, his hand dropping away from his belt, like the weight of his authority had suddenly become too much to bear. Eric closed the gap Larson had instinctively created, stepping forward. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand, unsure of how to escape. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, his voice steady, yet piercing. "Though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights. That I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold." Larson opened his mouth, but no words came. Eric's gaze locked onto him, unyielding. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," Eric finished for him, his words carrying the weight of an indictment. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." Larson's shoulders sagged, the full weight of Eric's words settling over him. He glanced down at the badge again, as if hoping it might vanish if he didn't look at it too closely. Eric stepped back, giving Larson a moment to breathe, but his voice remained unflinching. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back. Return my documents." Eric's voice dropped, becoming a quiet, controlled warning. "Think very carefully about what you say next." The words hung in the air like a silent storm waiting to break. Larson's lips parted, but they faltered, caught in a delicate balance between defiance and fear. He hesitated, as if deciding whether to challenge the calm authority before him or to submit. That hesitation, that split second of indecision, cost him more than he could realize. Eric's eyes narrowed, and his voice lowered just enough to sharpen the air between them. "You're going to hear from me again. Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." The words were steady, deliberate, each syllable a stake driving deeper into the moment. Larson's breath caught. He swallowed, a visible sign of the weight settling over him. His face flushed a deeper shade of red, as the consequences of Eric's words began to sink in. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled to pull out Eric's license and registration from his chest pocket. The hesitation was almost comical, but no one was laughing now. He handed them over without meeting Eric's gaze, the tremor in his fingers betraying his growing unease. Eric accepted the documents without a word, slipping them into his wallet with an air of finality. He turned toward the driver's side door of his car. His hand brushed against the handle, but before he could open it, he paused. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, thick with unsaid things. Eric turned slightly, just enough to lock eyes with Larson once more. His voice, calm yet laden with authority, cut through the silence like a sharp knife. "Remember this, Officer Larson. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." The words resonated, settling over Larson like a cold, hard truth he couldn't escape. As Eric slid into his car and the engine roared to life, Larson remained rooted to the spot, his confidence shattered, his mind racing, his future uncertain. But for Eric, the encounter was just a prologue. He knew this was far from over. The drive home was silent. But inside Eric's mind, it was anything but. The incident replayed over and over, not because it was special, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom, a reflection of a system that had long needed change. And Eric knew, deep down, that things couldn't stay the same. Not this time. This time, he had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, the soft rays of the early sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting long shadows across his office at the Internal Affairs Division of the Sacramento Police Department. A file lay open in front of him, and with a steady hand, he read through Officer Bradley Larson's record. It was hardly spotless: minor complaints, unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings, all left to fester without proper investigation. These were the signs of a much deeper problem, one that Eric was determined to address. He wasn't interested in patching up wounds with band-aids. He was ready to dig deeper. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened, and Linda, his assistant, stepped in, a stack of reports in her arms. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, her voice light but respectful. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded absently, taking the files from her without looking up. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the gravity in his tone, but quickly nodded and exited, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts. He returned his gaze to Larson's file, but it wasn't just about one officer. It was about a culture, a deep-rooted culture that allowed officers like Larson to feel justified in their actions. And that culture? It started at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric found himself sitting across from Chief Daniels in a quiet conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, listening intently as Eric recounted the details of the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric began, his voice steady but unwavering, "but that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "But we've always handled it internally. Quietly." Eric didn't flinch. Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud. Daniels met his gaze, the years of experience in his eyes revealing the internal battle. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation, his words clear, resolute. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." Eric's response was simple, but it carried the weight of a revolution in the making. "Good. It's about time someone did." The following weeks became a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, reports, and relentless work. Eric gathered data, spoke to officers, and held public forums, listening to the voices of the community. The incident with Larson became the catalyst for a much-needed change, a turning point. Larson faced an internal hearing, where Eric made sure to be present, watching as Larson squirmed under the intense scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't about punishing Larson. It was about preventing the next Larson from ever happening again. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and local residents. His voice rang out, clear and unwavering, as he spoke not of blame, but of responsibility. He talked of creating a system that worked for everyone, a system built on integrity, fairness, and respect. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, he said, his voice strong, it's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge we're building here together. The applause that followed was deafening, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As he stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight. But it was coming. And for now, that was enough.